Hi everyone, my name is Herkeph, and I have survived for 1000 days in this incredibly stupid hardcore world where I have only been allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor, so I thought it would be nice to make a compilation of everything that we have gotten up to in this world so far. And since we're compiling everything that we have done for 1000 days, this video is rather long. However, even if you don't have time to watch it, it would really help me out if you just left this video running in the background. But without further ado, let's get into it. Hi everyone, my name is Herkeph, and last week I died in my previous hardcore world in a rather anticlimactic way. In the last world, I set up a few rules. That being that I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. And now you might be asking, why would you do that to yourself? To which I respond, because I am a very stupid young man. But even though we were only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor, I still managed to survive for quite a while and build some decent things. But now that I'm done with our last world, I have decided to start a new hardcore world with the same rules. That's right, not only am I dumb enough to do it once, but twice. So I created the world and found myself in a plains biome, which was a very good start. I then quickly realized that there were two villages pretty much right next to where we spawned, which was a fact that helped fight off my crippling depression for a split second. Naturally, I scuttled over in glee, until I realized that I hadn't punched my first tree yet. Once the tree had been masterfully chopped, I made myself a set of tools and grabbed myself 3 pieces of dirt. I then attacked the village's iron golem and collected his crusty remains. And since I was in a village, I decided to run around and steal anything I thought might be useful. I then bounced over to the second village that we had seen from spawn, and repeated the process of harassing the village iron golem using a fragile wooden paddle, and stole some lava that they had lying around for some reason. I then used said lava to offer the local wildlife a promotion, and successfully promoted some cows to become executive steaks. I ate some bread in order to grow up big and strong like mum, and continued my adventure in hopes of finding a lava pool. I then almost immediately hit an ocean, which meant that I would have to continue my adventure by boat, so I crafted a luxury yacht and continued as I did. I then ran into a ruined nether portal, which I had a quick look into. I managed to find myself some fire charges and a golden apple. However, I decided that I wouldn't need the golden apple for some reason. I am not entirely sure why I left it there. But here we are, though shortly after we had bumbled our way through terrain, I managed to spot a lava pool, which was, of course, very exciting. So I built up the nether portal and ran off to chop some trees whilst I waited for the portal to light. I then crafted myself my first shield and a few axes to go through to the nether. I then found myself in a nether wastes bio, which was a very nice start. So with a boat in hand, I started our journey to find a nether fortress. I then went on to explore the nether for 1174 seconds, or roughly 20 minutes, though it sounds more intense when I say the number of seconds, so that's what I'll roll with. And after said 1174 seconds, I managed to find a nether fortress. So I scuttled in and spanked some blazes in hopes of them giving me their rod, and after a while I had managed to get a decent number of blaze rods. So I started my journey back to the nether portal that I came from, and on my way back I found yet another nether fortress, but this one was in a soul sand valley, which is perfect in case we would want to make a wither farm in the future, so I saved the location. However, on my way back, I noticed that I was completely lost, so I checked the coordinates that we had saved for our nether portal and started digging a tunnel. But after a very long time of tunneling through the nether, I finally emerged and was greeted by an angry moaning cloud who almost killed me. However, I did manage to make my way back to the overworld, so I once again utilized my luxury yacht and ran back to the villages that I found earlier. From there, I set up a temporary chest to store all of my junk that I had accumulated and boated along a river to collect clay. I then traded said clay for emeralds, which in turn I used to level up the village cleric. However, after spending a bunch of my hard-earned emeralds, the cleric decided to not give me an ender pearl trade, so I did the only reasonable thing there was to do and drowned the village cleric. I know, I am a very kind young man. I then leveled up another cleric who decided to give me an ender pearl trade, which I thought was a rather good choice on his part, so I traded my way up to 14 ender pearls and a bow along with a few stacks of arrows. I then started my adventure to find the stronghold. Once the Eyes of Ender had led me to a forest, I started excavating in search of the stronghold. I dug straight down, but did not manage to find the stronghold. I did so again, a few blocks to the side, and was faced with the exact same story. At this point, I was rather annoyed that I couldn't find the stronghold and decided to continue digging straight down, to hopefully find it eventually. And on my third attempt, I did manage to find the stronghold, and after a short exploration within the stronghold, I managed to find the portal room. So I set down a chest, as well as my bed, and jumped into the end. I then proceeded with the task of killing the dragon, which I did by shooting all of the end crystals and spanking the dragon's belly with my fragile wooden paddle, only taking breaks to wait for the dragon to descend. But after a lot of faffing around, I managed to kill the Ender Dragon. I was then showered by the dragon's balls and decided to steal the dragon egg. I then made my way through the end gateway, set my field of view to Quake Pro, and got onto the main task of this episode, finding an end city along with an elytra. After a bit of exploring, I did manage to find an end city, but it did not have a ship, meaning no elytra. It was rather disappointing, but I figured that I will probably run into another end city relatively quickly, which I did. However, the next one I found did not have a ship either, which was rather frustrating. So I continued my journey, and after a few minutes, I managed to find my third city of this world, but this one did not have a ship either. This same thing then happened the fourth time I found an end city. However, luck did finally turn, and the fifth end city did actually have a ship, meaning I could finally get my elytra and not have to walk like an absolute peasant. So I pillared my way up to the boat directly, stole my first elytra of this world, and crafted a couple of shulker boxes to free up some of my inventory space. I then decided to loot the rest of the end city in hopes of getting some shulker shells, as well as obsidian from the ender chests I came across. I then proceeded to raid a few more end cities, and once my immense greed had been fed, I made my way back through an end gateway and went back to the stronghold. Once in the stronghold, I located the libraries and decided to steal all of the books I could get my hands on. This was, of course, incredibly thrilling and exciting to do with my completely unenchanted wooden tools. And after I had collected all the books, I jumped back into the end portal and found myself back at where I initially spawned. I then picked up the things that I had stored away in a temporary chest and headed off in hopes of finding a good spot for our starter base. And after a bit of exploring, I managed to find a really nice bowl shape with a bunch of cherry trees, which looked rather pleasing. So I chopped one of the cherry trees down and picked up all of the saplings I could. I've actually never used cherry wood for any base or house before, so I was a bit out of my depth, but I was determined to do it. I did a tiny bit of building in my creative world and settled on a block palette that used cherry wood. So I then jumped into the nether and started collecting the materials that I would need to construct my starter base. But now it was about time to start settling down and build my starter base. Hi everyone, my name is Herkeph, and welcome back to my second incredibly stupid hardcore world where I am only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. Today, we're starting off by excavating below our starter house that we built last episode. The reason we want to excavate under our house is because we need to get a simple villager setup going, as using unenchanted tools and armor is a bit too masochistic even for me. I then ran off to sleep in my bed that is still placed right next to our house that I spent a rather long time building, though I was quickly woken up by a zombie wearing golden armor who kindly informed me that he had been watching me sleep. I was offended that he didn't try to make a move and lightly spanked him to show him that I'm available. I then got back to the incredibly thrilling task of digging out an area using unenchanted wooden tools, and once the area had been dug out, I started luring a bunch of unemployed degenerates over to my basement with the promise of employment. I then pushed said unemployed degenerates into a hole leading to my basement. However, when I started luring the second civilian towards his new forever home, I noticed that this one seemed to be rather special, as he managed to get stuck on a decorative wall. However, they don't need to be particularly bright to reproduce, so I didn't mind too much. So I lured the second villager towards my basement, where he would spend the rest of his life. I find it funny how the meta in a game made for children mainly revolves around slavery. But I digress. Once the second degenerate had been successfully relocated to my basement, I made my way back into the village in order to steal some beds, as they would be needed for my infinite villager breeder. So I then placed the beds in the villager breeder and planted some potatoes that I had acquired in a highly moral and legal way. I then continued digging out our basement to give us some more space and put in a pickup system that would allow us to transport the villagers out of the breeder. And whilst I had been working on the villager setup, I also decided to bring my bed inside the house that I had spent a pretty long time building. This way, I didn't have to sleep outside like an alcoholic. When I woke up in the comfort of our shack, I continued digging out our basement in preparation of our villager trading setup. And since we now have to wait for the baby makers in our basement to start reproducing, I decided that it would be a smart idea to start preparing our iron farm. So I crafted myself some pickaxes as well as a few shovels and started digging out a 9x9 area right next to my house. The iron farm I'm building is the same that I always go for. It's pretty efficient, cheap, and not too hard to build. I'll link the tutorial I'm following in the description down below. However, even though the farm is quite easy to build, I realized that I had managed to pick out a spot with a water cave, which was rather inconvenient. So I filled the cave with dirt and continued building the farm. However, as I was building the farm, I realized that my house has a few safety issues, as I discovered a creeper right by my bed. And this creeper was rather rude, as he decided to explode right in the middle of my house. And once the iron farm was ready to be stocked up with villagers and a zombie, I started working a tiny bit on our house interior, as there was simply no interior to speak of at this point. And once I had made our house a tiny bit more habitable, I got to the exciting task of trapping a zombie who would scare the shit out of our villagers to produce iron golems. This was, as always, rather easy since zombies have an IQ that is about as low as mine. But eventually, I did manage to get the iron farm up and running, or so I thought, as it stopped working for some reason. I thought that the most likely explanation of my iron farm not working is because there was probably a cave near the iron farm, and an iron golem must have spawned in said cave, instead of my spawning platform, so I decided to go to the Nether to pick up some soul sand to take advantage of an X-ray glitch. However, once I returned to the overworld with my precious soul sand, I quickly came to the realization that the X-ray glitch didn't work anymore, so I started doing the only logical thing and frantically started mining in hopes of finding the spot where the iron golem was chilling. However, this took a very long time and was incredibly inefficient, so I decided to phone up a friend asking if he knew of any other X-ray glitches. Just kidding, I don't have any friends. I googled and found myself yet another X-ray glitch, but this one actually worked, and in no time, I managed to spot the rogue iron golem who had ruined the iron farm. So I dug my way to the cave in which the iron golem had spawned and killed it. I then started putting slabs to prevent more iron golems from spawning. I then spent some time monitoring to make sure that there weren't any other places where iron golems could spawn outside of my spawning platform. However, that didn't seem to be the case, so I decided to move on with my life. So I lured a zombie into my house and brought him down to the basement, where he would spend the rest of his life converting my villagers for my financial gain. I know, I am a very gentle and kind man. However, once the zombie had been put into his designated spot, I noticed that an iron golem had spawned right in our basement, which was definitely an inconvenience, so I removed some of the floor and killed the iron golem. I then placed slabs in order to prevent further spawning of iron golems, and once the iron farm had been fixed for a second time, I decided to head back to the Nether to procure myself some gold for golden apples. And as I was mining gold in the Nether, a friendly neighborhood freak decided to come up to me to say hello. I informed him that I didn't have any change and gave him a light-hearted spanking. However, his friend seemed to get a bit jealous of his friend's spanking and decided to also come up and say hello. This almost cost me my entire hardcore world, as I almost plummeted to my death. I then continued to gather gold until I ran into an angry moaning cloud who challenged me to a ping-pong duel of epic proportions. And once I had collected enough gold to satisfy my immense greed, I made my way back to the overworld. Though once I got back to my house, the game decided to prank me by spawning in 1,000,000 zombies right outside of my house. So I ran in and went to sleep as soon as possible and woke up to the symphony of burning cadavers. I then crafted up the golden apples that I had worked my butt off for and started the process of curing villagers, and then began the exciting adventure of placing and breaking lecterns until I get a trade that I want. And after a very long time of placing and breaking lecterns, I had finally managed to acquire quite a decent amount of good trades. So I immediately started enchanting my armor in hopes of not dying like an absolute noob. I then enchanted my first pickaxe as well as a sword, so we could more easily collect gunpowder going forward. Hi everyone, my name is Herkeph and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world, where I am only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. As some of you may know, I died in my last hardcore world, but not only did I die in an incredibly unsatisfying and anticlimactic way, and in my last world, I had a bunch of farms that produced some very useful items for me, whilst I could sit on my fat behind, doing absolutely nothing. However, this is a luxury that I no longer have, so in today's episode, I will be building what I think are some of the most important farms, so that I may once again start lazing around like an absolute degenerate. So we're starting off by exploring for a bit, in hopes of finding a pillager outpost so that we can get started building a raid farm. The reason we're starting off with a raid farm is because I will most likely end up dying quite soon if I don't get my hands on some totems of undying. The raid farm that I will be building is required to be built in a deep ocean. So ideally, we want to find a pillager outpost that is somewhat close to a deep ocean. That way we won't have to fly for too long when we want to use it. And after a couple minutes of flying, I spotted my first pillager outpost of this world. However, this one wasn't close to an ocean, which was rather disappointing. And just to make things even worse, the pillager outpost did not have any scarecrows, meaning I couldn't even steal any carved pumpkins. Nonetheless, I still decided to fly in to grab myself a goat horn, but overall, this pillager outpost was rather bad. I'd rate it a solid 2 out of 10. So I decided to keep looking for a pillager outpost that wasn't as shit as this one. And whilst I kept exploring, I came across a village that had some of the weirdest terrain I've ever seen, as there was a house that was randomly plonked on top of a random hill in the middle of the village. So I reacted in the only reasonable way and kicked down the door and threw the civilian out of his bed before heading out to continue our adventure. And after a bit more exploring, I managed to find myself yet another pillager outpost, and this one actually had scarecrows, which briefly restored my will to live. And after having looted the pillager outpost, I discovered that there was an ocean rather close to it, which meant that we had found the location to build our raid farm. So I flew back home and started making some preparations for the farm. However, in order to actually use the raid farm, I'm going to need a sword with sweeping edge. The reason we need that is because there's a chance that the evokers don't die from my attacks otherwise, meaning they will spawn in a bunch of vexes, which would mean a very quick death for me. So I decided to expand our villager trading setup in order to get sweeping edge, as well as a few other enchantments. And whilst we were waiting for our zombified villagers to convert back into normal villagers, I decided that it might be a good idea to actually label our villagers that we already had set up. I then got to the incredibly fun and engaging task of placing and breaking lecterns over and over again until they give me a trade I want. But eventually, I managed to get all of the enchantments that I was after. Now all I had to do was to collect all of the materials that I am going to need to actually construct the farm. I then started flying all the way back towards the pillager outpost that we had found earlier and kidnapped a villager on my way, which was the last thing that we needed in order to build the raid farm. And once we had made it all the way back to the ocean near the pillager outpost we found earlier, I started constructing the raid farm. And now that we have infinite access to golden babies and emeralds, I decided to start preparing for the next farm that we're going to build. So I brutally slaughtered a turtle and fed his crusty remains to some other turtles to then take their babies away from them. When doing stuff like this, I always get joy out of remembering that this is a game made for literal children. I then spent some time killing some creepers as we still don't have a farm to get gunpowder. And once I had made some preparations, I dove into the nether to collect some magma. And as most of you have already guessed, yes, the next farm we're going to build is a gold farm. The reason we need a gold farm is quite straightforward. I'm going to need a bartering farm to actually get a viable source of obsidian. And we also get a bunch of blocks that we can use for building, which is a rather nice bonus. So once I had collected all of the materials that we would need for the gold farm, I made my way to the nether roof and relinked a new portal to my starter base. And once the portal had successfully been linked, I started looking for a nether wastes biome, which was rather easy to find. And building the gold farm without swift sneak was just as fun as one may imagine. This is probably one of my least favorite farms to build, simply because it has to be built whilst crouching, which is rather soul-crushing. But after an incredibly long time, I finally finished the gold farm and got it up and running, meaning I could now get started on the AFK area. And this is where I was going to enslave a couple piglins to use for my bartering farm. so I built up a temporary spawning platform to hopefully get some piglins to spawn. And after a very long time of waiting, we finally managed to get 2 piglins to spawn, meaning the bartering farm was pretty much done. So I put in some finishing touches and went to FK to let the farm work its magic, and now that we have a stable production of obsidian, we can go ahead and get started with our next farm, which will be a shulker farm. The reason we're building a shulker farm is because I am incredibly lazy and can't be bothered to go end raiding for hours on end, and we're actually going to need quite many shulker boxes, as we're going to want to build a mega base relatively soon, meaning we're going to need to transport a lot of materials. However, in order to build the shulker farm that I have in mind, we're going to need a bunch of carved pumpkins to make snow golems. So I spent some time looking for pillager outposts in hopes of snagging some from their scarecrows. But before getting started with the next farm, I decided that it would be a good idea to link our end portal to the nether roof so that we can have quick access to the end going forward. I then got on to the preparations for our next farm. So I crafted a bunch of rails as well as powered rails, which we're going to need to transport our future kidnapping victim, which will come in the form of a shulker. So I made my way to the end and started placing down all the rails as well as a bunch of buttons to prevent my kidnapping victim from running away in the wrong direction. And once all of the rails and buttons had been placed, I made my way to the end gateway and started my search for an end city that is close to an end gateway. But after a few minutes of exploring, I came across the worst end city generation that I have ever seen. The end city did have a boat, but the part of the boat where you get the elytra simply didn't generate. I then thanked God that I didn't run into this end city as my first one, and after a bit more exploring, I finally ran into not 1, not 2, but 3 end cities that were rather close to an end gateway. So I decided to steal the wings simply because I could, and got onto the task of kidnapping a couple shulkers and shoving them into the end gateway. However, once I made it back to the main end island, I realized that I had forgotten to place buttons in some spots, which made my life significantly harder than it had to be. I then went on to try to fix my silly little mistake and realized that I may as well kill one of the shulkers, as it will make my life even harder trying to salvage both of the shulkers I had stolen. However, after a bit of trying to fix the shulker issue, I accidentally looked at a couple endermen, which made an already annoying situation even more annoying. And since I am very bad at this game, I ended up almost dying to said enderman twice. And after having retrieved the rogue shulker, I decided to go for attempt number 2 of getting the shulker into the overworld. However, since I have room temperature level IQ, I had forgotten to place even more buttons, which caused me to end up with the exact same issue as before. I then continued struggling, getting the shulker into the overworld for a bit more, but I simply wasn't smart enough to actually get it working, which makes sense since I haven't watched all of Rick and Morty yet. So I decided to fly off, once again, to kidnap a fresh batch of shulkers to get a bit of a fresh start. And finally, after what felt like forever, I did manage to get a shulker to the overworld. But I think that is where I'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Hi everyone, my name is Herkeph and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world where I am only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In last week's episode, we managed to get a shulker into the overworld, but we never actually got to building the shulker farm that I had planned to build. This is mainly because I am a very lazy young man who loves procrastinating, but the time has now come to actually build the farm so that we may move on with our lives. The farm I'm planning to build is a design by ENX04. I will go ahead and leave a link to the tutorial down in the description below. But without further ado, let's get started building this thing. However, since I have a lukewarm IQ level, I forgot that rain kills snow golems, so I accidentally wasted one of my precious carved pumpkins. However, even with that horrific loss, I continued building the farm. And after an incredibly long time of building, we finally have a shulker farm up and running. But now that we finally have access to infinite shulker boxes, we're going to need a place to store them. So I decided that it's probably time to start making ender chests so that I can access all of my stuff when I'm out and about, doing random stupid things. This means that we will have to go to the Nether to pick up some blaze rods. However, when I came through the portal, I was greeted by a deformed swine who was determined to end my whole career. But since I had some rockets, I managed to escape in a very heroic and brave manner. So I then made it to a nether fortress nearby and started spanking some blazes in hopes of them deciding to give me their good rod. And once I had been satisfied by their good rods, I flew back home and crafted some ender chests and filled it with shulker boxes. And now that we're fully set up with an ender chest and shulkers, I decided that it was time to start setting up a shulker for spare tools. So I crafted up a bunch of tools and started trading with my villagers for all the enchantments. I then went on to spend over an hour grinding at the raid farm and enchanting all of my tools. This was, of course, an incredibly fun and engaging thing to do. But after a very long time, I had finally enchanted all of the tools in my toolbox, so I decided to head back to the Nether and grind some wither skeletons. I'm not entirely sure why I decided to go and farm wither skeletons, as I don't have a particularly good track record, but here we are, so I once again lightly spanked the wither skeletons until they agreed to give me head, as one does. And just like some of you may have guessed, I messed up once more in the exact same way as my last playthrough and ended up using my first ever totem of undying of this world. I know, that must be very shocking to hear. However, even after that massive screw up, I decided to continue farming wither skeleton skulls, proving once again that I didn't learn a thing. So I continued until I had finally gotten myself enough wither skeleton skulls to spawn in the wither. And unlike last time, I didn't waste any time mining out the roof of the Nether and headed straight to the end to cheese the Wither. I know that it would once again make for significantly better content to fight the Wither legitimately, but I had already gotten quite close to dying, so I decided to actually have a normal IQ for once and not take the risk. But now that we have our beacon ready to be used, I decided to start work on our next farm. As you may have noticed, I still do not have a viable source of gunpowder, as I have to kill a bunch of creepers manually to get my rockets like an absolute peasant. But since we now have a bunch of shulker boxes, I figured it was about time to start getting a better way of getting gunpowder. However, we had already used all of our carved pumpkins to spawn in snow golems for our shulker farm, and I am too lazy to go out exploring for more carved pumpkins, so I couldn't build the same creeper farm that I usually build. So I decided to build a general mob farm instead, as I am also going to need a ton of bones anyways. The mob farm that I decided to build is a very old design that was made by Nembomb. If I am not mistaken, I will, as always, link the tutorial I followed in the description box below. and after spending some time at FK, the farm had produced a pretty decent amount of gunpowder, so I flew back home and did what every Minecraft player loves doing, organizing my items. I also decided to craft up a bunch of rockets, so that I may continue flying around like an absolute knob without worrying about wasting rockets. But now that we have all of that out of the way, I thought it would be good to talk a tiny bit about my plans for this world, specifically my plans for my mega base. I have decided to build in a style that I am absolutely terrible at building, futuristic, and that is the reason why we are going to need a ton of bones, as we are going to be using a lot of white concrete. And to contrast a bit with the white concrete, we're also going to need a lot of cyan terracotta, which is very convenient, as I just managed to get us our first beacon. So I flew over to the nearest mesa biome, set up my beacon, and got to work deconstructing a mountain. However, that didn't last for very long, as I came to the rude realization that 10 wooden pickaxes only have enough durability to get slightly more than one shulker box of terracotta, meaning that this will take a very long time and several trips back and forward between the mesa biome and my raid farm. However, by an absolute miracle, I decided to use both of my brain cells and decided to also grab as much sand as possible that we can use to make white concrete. That way, we won't have to get back to doing that later. In other words, I actually discovered multitasking, and after a very long time, I had finally collected a decent amount of terracotta and sand, meaning I could get onto the next preparations for my mega base. As I said earlier, I will be mainly building my mega base using white concrete and cyan terracotta. But I don't actually have a way of getting cyan dye at the moment, so that will be the next step for us. However, before moving on to that, I had to make a few new tools, as I managed to break several whilst collecting materials. I know I am a very intelligent young man, so in order to get cyan dye, we're going to need green and blue dye. Getting blue dye is relatively easy, as I can simply trade with my clerics to get lapis, but in order to get green dye, we're going to need to build yet another farm, this time in the form of a cactus farm. So I gathered up all of the materials we need and got to work building our cactus farm, right on top of our mob farm so that we can have both of them running at the same time. I know, I am a very smart and talented young boy. The cactus farm I decided to build is a really old farm, and I have no idea who came up with it. Please let me know if you recognize the design and I'll put it in the description. But anyways, that is where I'll go ahead and leave it for this week. We managed to get a lot done in terms of farms and preparations ahead of our mega base. Hi everyone, my name is Herkeph and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world where I am only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In today's episode, we're starting things off by fighting off some Jehovah's Witnesses from my doorstep, but never mind them. In last week's episode, we started gathering materials that we'll need for our biggest project yet, which is my new base. However, since I am a proper masochist, I've decided that we're going to be building a futuristic base, and with said futuristic theme. I've also picked out a block palette that is rather annoying to obtain in survival mode, which is an aspect that I was too lazy to consider earlier. But nonetheless, in our block palette that I have picked out for us, our main light source will be frog lights, which is only obtainable by having frogs eat magma cubes. And depending on what color frog ate the magma cube, a different color frog light will plop into existence in a very magical fashion. And since I am a completionist, I figured that we will want to be able to farm all colors, which will make my life significantly harder and provide a rather questionable upside. So in order to get the process started in getting all of the frog lights, I started force feeding the crusty cadaver of a slime to some unsuspecting frogs, who then rewarded me by handing me their offspring. However, said offspring will actually need to hatch in order for me to be able to kidnap them, so I decided to spend my time jumping around in a swamp. I dedicated myself to this incredibly productive task until the frogs spawn eventually hatched. I then quickly placed a couple babies in the buckets I had prepared and flew off. I then decided to explore for a bit in order to find all different temperature biomes. In order to obtain all of the frog variants and therefore all frog light variants, we're going to have to raise the frogs in all different temperatures. And after a not very long time at all, I managed to find myself a cold biome, which was the last temperature we were looking for, as we had already found a mesa, which counts as a warm biome. However, soon after I had found a cold biome, I stumbled upon a pillager outpost, which actually had a few carved pumpkins, which I always have time to steal. I then made my way back home and got to making the preparations to start building the froglight farm. So I gathered up all of the materials that we would need and placed down my kidnapping victims in my basement. I then flew off in the nether to find a basalt delta and started constructing the frog light farm, like the very productive young man that I am. And once the farm was pretty much done, I started raising some frogs in my basement, which counted as a normal biome, giving us the orange variety of frog. I then put all of the frogs on leads and shoved them into the nether. I then dragged them all the way to the farm that we had constructed, which allowed me to tick off the first frog variety that we needed. I then wasted no time at all and flew straight to the mesa biome that we had used to get terracotta in our previous episode, and prepared an area for our precious frogs. Once all of the warm frogs had been successfully raised, I repeated the exact same process where I brought all of the frogs to the farm. I then checked off the warm frogs, leaving only the cold frogs that I still had to sort out. And before long, I had raised the cold frogs as well, and did the exact same thing as before. And once we had all of the frog varieties in the killing chamber, I continued building the rest of the farm. And once the farm was completely up and running, I came to the realization that I still didn't have a decent source of food even though we are 5 episodes into this world, so I decided to set up 4 farmers and leveled them up so that we could have a source of golden carrots. And now that I am thinking about it, I'm not entirely sure why I hadn't done this significantly earlier, as it would have saved a lot of time and been rather convenient to actually have food. Anyways, now that we finally had food sorted, I started collecting even more sand, as we are going to need an absolutely ridiculous amount of white concrete to build our base. And once we had collected a decent amount of sand, I got to the incredibly thrilling and engaging task of crafting the white concrete powder as well as the cyan terracotta. And after a very long time of purely crafting, I flew off to the middle of the ocean to finally start construction of my mega base. However, shortly after starting the construction, I ran into yet another issue. In order to actually progress with the circle that I had started, I am going to need hardened concrete, and all I had at this point was concrete powder, so I flew over to my starter house and picked up some redstone stuff. Once the smart people stuff had successfully been acquired, I flew over to my mob farm and decided that it would be the ideal spot to build my concrete converter. My reasoning was that the concrete converter was going to require a lot of TNT, meaning I'd need a lot of gunpowder, so if I built the concrete converter in range of the mob farm, I'd have less downtime. I was rather proud of the thinking that I did there, as I tend to not think very much. I was in fact so proud that I completely threw myself off and realized that I had no idea what I was doing. So I then went on to improvise a concrete converter, which failed completely. So I decided to jump into a creative testing world. The idea I had was that I'd use two observers facing each other, which would cause them to spam redstone outputs. I would then have said redstone output feed into a piston, which would push the concrete towards the TNT and explode it. At the same time, the redstone signal would also feed into a dropper that would replenish the concrete powder that I was placing. That way I'd be able to be completely AFK whilst running the converter. However, what I completely forgot to account for was that the TNT couldn't keep up with the piston pushing the concrete, meaning that the dropper would replenish my concrete powder significantly faster than I was able to place it. So I had to make a few adjustments in order to get it to work. However, once I had gotten it to work, I decided to build it somewhere else. I am not entirely sure why I decided to do that, as I had actually put a lot of thought into the placement of it. So basically, I had a smart idea and decided to completely ignore it. But nevertheless, I did manage to get the concrete converter to work and went to AFK. I then got back to some major stonks, which came in the form of completely hardened concrete. I then got back to the incredibly thrilling and engaging task of building a circle in the middle of the ocean. Now that the circle is done, my plan is to fill in the circle with dirt to basically make a man-made island, but futuristic. Hi everyone, my name is Herkeph and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world where I am only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In last week's episode, we managed to start making some progress on our new base where we built a giant circle in the middle of an ocean, and today we're going to continue making as much progress on our base as possible so that it isn't just a big circle in the middle of the ocean, which is, at the moment, rather useless. So to start us off, I did what every Minecraft player enjoys the most about the game: gather dirt. And once we had collected a decent amount of dirt, I fired up the replay mod where I got to work filling in our man-made island. Now that was a rather long time lapse. However, it took significantly longer for me. In that last minute and a half of this video, I spent over 7.5 hours of constant block placing, and we are still far from being done. It is at times like this I start questioning all of my life choices, but I digress, and in an attempt to have an average IQ, I decided to use as much powdered concrete as possible in place of hardened concrete. That way, I won't have to use our concrete converter that uses a lot of TNT. And yes, I am well aware that I can build a concrete converter that is more TNT efficient, but both my IQ and motivation are significantly too low for that. So I am now stuck moisturizing this concrete powder in a very peasant-like fashion. But after a bit of concrete moisturizing, I once again got back to placing more dirt. And after a monstrous amount of dirt placing we have completed in this episode so far, I decided to actually make an entrance into the center platform that we had built, and add a staircase to actually get up on top of the platform. I did build it out of white concrete, but in all honesty, I was too lazy to try to make it look good, so I simply went for it, and let this become a problem for future Herkeph. And because of stuff like this, I'm sure that guy hates me at this point. And in between clips, I have also put down a footprint to help me construct the actual structure that will go on top of my center platform. That way, I made sure that I placed everything in the center, which was a very rare smart move from my part. So I then got to constructing the main structure of my new base. However, that was rather short-lived, as I quickly realized that I had grossly underestimated the amount of white concrete I needed to build my base. So I had to take a break to fly back and forth between the desert and my raid farm to collect a ton of sand. This was, as you can imagine, a very fun task. I then dropped by my gold farm to pick up some more gravel and got to the even more fun task of crafting all of the white concrete. I then came to the rude realization that I had completely run out of TNT for my concrete converter and had to go AFK at my mob farm. But my AFK session did yield quite a decent amount of gunpowder, which I used instantly to make more TNT to use at my concrete converter. And after spending even more time AFK, this time at my concrete converter, I had managed to accumulate some white concrete. But the material gathering didn't stop there, because I had almost completely run out of Saiyan terracotta as well. So I had to spend some time getting myself some blue and green dye and crafting up all of the Saiyan terracotta. But after this brief interruption, I once again got back to building my base. and now the main structure of my base is pretty close to being completed. However, for the next part of this project, I decided to start making paths that I could walk on outside of the main platform. I am not entirely sure why I prioritized this, as I will most probably not use it that much, but here we are, and since I enjoy making my life significantly harder than it needs to be, I decided to build the path out of smooth stone, which I had to collect and smelt a bunch of stone for. But after a brief stone gathering mission, I had managed to get my hands on a rather puny amount of smooth stone. So I started marking out the shape of the walkway, using frog lights to then come in with the smooth stone later. I originally wanted to do another circle, but I decided that I couldn't be bothered making any more circles. I.e., I am a very lazy young man, therefore I decided to make the walkway a hexagon instead. I did make some decent progress on the walkway, but I unfortunately ran out of smooth stone, so I took a step back to see how everything was looking and noticed that the base looked rather bare. I was honestly not entirely sure how to fix that, so I decided to once again be lazy and just plant a ton of cherry trees to add some more color. However, after planting all of the cherry trees, I realized that I had essentially turned the entire man-made island into a mob farm. So I started running around placing lanterns on the trees to stop all of the unwanted guests from spawning. And once that small issue had been dealt with, I thought it might be a good idea to make my newly built base at least somewhat habitable. So I decided to start dealing with the interior of the top floor. Hi everyone, my name is Herkeph and welcome back to my incredibly stupid, hardcore world where I am only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In last week's episode, we managed to make quite a lot of progress on our new base. However, it is still far from being done. So in today's episode, our main objective is to actually make our base somewhat habitable and have it not look like the home of an absolute psychopath. So my next step was to actually decide what I want to have available in my base. So I wrote a few signs so that we at least have some clue of what we're supposed to be doing. My plan for this base is to have a bunch of farms feed into a central storage that will be located inside of the center platform. That's also where I intend to keep my villagers once we have that set up. So that was the first area that I wanted to make look somewhat decent. And just to keep things on brand, I've decided to keep making my life significantly harder than it needs to be. That's why I decided to use quartz to decorate the inside of the central platform. And like most of you would probably have guessed, I had, once again, severely underestimated how much building materials that I'd need for this project. But this time, we ran out of quartz, so I decided to go AFK at my bartering farm. But I then remembered that I have the patience of a hungry toddler and decided to go and mine quartz in the actual nether instead. But even though I had Fortune 3 on my pickaxes, the process was still painfully slow. So slow in fact, that I got distracted by a bastion, even though there's nothing useful that I could possibly have found there. But nonetheless, I then got back to mining quartz. And after having spent an excruciatingly long time in the nether, I finally got back to the overworld with slightly less than a shulker of quartz blocks. So I then got back to placing said hard-earned quartz blocks in the form of pillars. However, in order to actually progress with my base, I am going to need a much better way of smelting stuff, as I have been using a very peasant-like setup for a very long time. So I decided to take a break from building the interior to build a super smelter. However, even though I have built many super smelters in the past, my highly limited IQ still made me manage to mess up building this one, so I had to tear it all down and build it once more. However, this time, I actually managed to build it correctly. I then got back to decorating the interior of the platform and decided to incorporate some cherry wood, as we had already used a lot of pink in our base. And since I was significantly too lazy to go for yet another quartz mining session, I decided to go FK at my bartering farm overnight instead. But unfortunately, we only managed to get about half of a shulker of quartz blocks, which was rather disappointing. So I now understand how my dad feels when I tell him I made yet another Minecraft video, but nevertheless, I started decorating our interior once again. I then decided that we were going to place our nether portal in the middle of the platform, so I decorated that as well. And once that was more or less done, I thought it might be a good idea to also deal with the interior of the actual base, as I intend to spend a substantial amount of time there. And at the time, the bottom part of my base was completely empty, so I decided to put in a floor and fix the walls on the interior. I then started building a staircase in the middle of the building, so that we actually have a way of getting up and down in our base, and for some reason I decided to use spruce to make the staircase. I'm not entirely sure why I decided to do that, since it doesn't look particularly futuristic, so I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to keep the stairs as they are. I say that, but I'm a very lazy young man, so the probability of me actually going back to fix it is rather low. But we do have stairs now, which are actually functional, so it's at least something. I then went back to one of the donuts that I had built for my base and found an almost full shulker of smooth quartz that I thought I had lost forever. But at this point, I had already spent a bunch of time getting more quartz, so I felt like I had been ripped off. However, I did find a use for the smooth quartz immediately, as I started putting in a floor for the donuts, so that I can actually access them in case I want to do something with them in the future. I then installed water elevators, so that I actually have a way to access the higher floors in my incredibly vertical base. And to get down, I decided to use powdered snow with carpets on top, so I don't take any unnecessary fall damage. And when I was out exploring to find powdered snow, I ran into a pillager outpost. But this one had 8 carved pumpkins, which I very happily stole. Finding the powdered snow wasn't too difficult, so I grabbed some from a mountain that I found and placed it in by my water elevator. I was then getting rather annoyed by all the mobs that were making noise on my roof, so I decided to cover my entire roof with carpets to prevent the hoodlums from partying on my property. I then got on to checking things off from the list that we wrote at the start of the episode. See, I actually didn't forget about the list. Anyways, the next thing I wanted to check off the list was a mob farm. And now you might be wondering why I'm building yet another mob farm when I already built one a couple episodes ago. And the answer to that is rather simple. Because I'm a very silly and dumb young man. But regardless, I started constructing the new mob farm. But now that the mob farm is complete, we are going to have to cover it up, as it is looking very ugly at the moment. So I once again got back to the incredibly fun and engaging task of gathering the materials for white concrete as well as sand terracotta. I then got to work covering up our ugly mob farm. I apologize, but it appears that the Minecraft gods have decided that I should consume excrement, as the last part of the time-lapse got corrupted. But now that we have the mob farm as well as the tower to cover it up, it's looking rather weird that we don't have towers for our other platforms as well. So I decided to build the same tower on all other sides to make everything symmetrical. I was then about to end the episode, but I realized that I had completely forgotten to actually make a storage system for all of our mob drops from our farm, so I flew off to collect some wood for some more chests and went on to build the storage. So to actually transport all of the items from our mob farm to our storage, we have two options. Either we run a hopper line straight from our mob farm to our storage, or we can use water streams, which would save us a bunch of iron. Since I'm a very cheap man, I decided to go for the second option. However, this meant that we are going to need ice, so that the items don't get stuck. So I flew off once again to try to find a frozen ocean where we could collect some ice. I then went on to explore for tens of thousands of blocks until I finally found a frozen ocean with bits of blue ice. So I gathered up as much as I could with the pickaxes I have and started flying back. And after flying about halfway back to my base, I came across another frozen ocean, meaning I had flown for several thousands of blocks for absolutely no reason. However, I did make it back to my base and put in the transportation system for our items. And there we have it, the first 1000 days in my incredibly stupid hardcore world. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please leave a like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you in the next video. Oh, and feel free to check out my hardcore series that is linked on the screen. Have a good one.